The silence was louder than any anthem ever played at the Invictus Games. Let me ask you something right away. What happens when the very people an institution was created to honor decide they've had enough and quietly walk away? Not protest, not press conferences, not viral speeches, just absence, just withdrawal, just gone. Because that is the allegation shaking the foundations of the 2027 Invictus Games in the United Kingdom right now. 2,000 veterans. That number keeps resurfacing in whispers, in closed-door conversations, in carefully worded messages that never make headlines. And if it's even partially true, this isn't just a scheduling issue or a PR headache. This is an existential crisis. Here's the shocking part. Invictus was never supposed to be fragile. It was built on resilience, on grit, on the idea that wounded soldiers don't quit, even when their bodies force them to relearn how to walk, how to run, how to live. So when veterans are the ones allegedly withdrawing, the question isn't why they're leaving. The question is what drove them to that point. And even more uncomfortable, who? Because floating at the center of this growing storm are two names that were once inseparable from the game's identity. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Now pause for a second. Breathe. This is not a simple villain story. It never is. It's more complicated, more human, more uncomfortable than that. And that's exactly why it matters. The Invictus Games were born out of pain, but also purpose. A wounded soldier is not a broken soldier. That was the message. Competition not as spectacle, but as recovery. Strength not as image, but as survival. For years, that message resonated deeply. Veterans trusted it. They showed up for it. They believed in it. So what changed? Because something did. And you can feel it in the way people talk now. Carefully. Hesitantly. As if naming the problem out loud feels like betrayal. Let's rewind. Picture a British veteran in his early 40s. Multiple tours. A body that doesn't behave the way it used to. He hears the UK will host the Invictus Games again in 2027. Home soil. Family nearby. Familiar culture. A chance to compete where his service actually happened. For him, it feels symbolic. Full circle. He starts training again. Early mornings. Physical therapy. Pain managed, not eliminated. Pride creeping back in. And then, slowly, something shifts. It's not one dramatic moment. It never is. It's a collection of small things. Meetings that feel more polished than practical. Messaging that feels more brand conscious than veteran focused. A sense that the spotlight isn't where he thought it would be. He starts asking quiet questions. So do others. Is this still about us? Or is it about something else now? Here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because many of the concerns being discussed aren't about hostility. They're about distance. Emotional distance. Cultural distance. A feeling that the games have drifted from the raw, unfiltered reality of military recovery into something more curated, more performative. And that feeling, according to multiple reported accounts and insider conversations, intensified after Meghan Markle became more visible within the Invictus ecosystem. Now listen carefully. Visibility is not wrongdoing. Presence is not guilt. But perception matters, especially in military culture, where hierarchy, humility, and shared hardship are everything. Ask yourself this. How does a soldier who spent years avoiding attention feel when their story is suddenly framed as a backdrop? That tension, reportedly, has been building quietly for years. Publicly, everything looks fine. Smiles. Applause. Carefully edited highlights. But beneath that surface, veterans allegedly began expressing a sense of displacement. Not anger at first. Confusion. Then frustration. Then resignation. And here's the contradiction that makes this story so compelling. Prince Harry is not an outsider to military culture. He served. He trained. He knows what that world values. Which makes the alleged disconnect even harder to reconcile. So why would veterans feel unheard? Some suggest it's not about intent. It's about evolution. The Invictus Games grew. The platform expanded. Media attention increased. With that came sponsors, branding, global narratives. And slowly, subtly, the center of gravity may have shifted. When an organization grows, someone always loses proximity to power. And in this case, veterans are asking whether they became that someone. Now layer in the symbolism of the UK. Hosting the games in Britain isn't just logistical. It's emotional. British veterans carry a particular relationship with the monarchy, with tradition, with service that predates social media by centuries. For some, Invictus returning to the UK felt like a chance to reset, to realign with those values. Instead, what some allegedly experienced was the opposite, a continuation of a direction they were already uneasy about. That's when the word withdrawal starts appearing, not as a protest, not as a threat, but as a decision. You have to understand how serious that is. Veterans don't withdraw lightly. Walking away goes against everything they were trained to do, which is why, if this is happening at scale, it signals something deeper than disagreement. It signals loss of trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't come back with press releases. So why haven't we heard more about this? That might be the most revealing part of all. Veterans are not influencers. They don't chase headlines. Many actively avoid them. Complaining publicly feels wrong. Speaking out feels disloyal, especially when the institution in question was created with good intentions. So instead, conversations happen quietly. Decisions are made privately, and numbers grow without anyone announcing them. Until suddenly, organizers are allegedly scrambling. Because 2,000 veterans don't just represent 2,000 athletes. They represent teams, families, communities, volunteers, credibility. They represent the moral authority of Invictus itself. And when those people hesitate, donors hesitate, sponsors hesitate, the public senses something is off, even if they can't quite name it. Now let's talk about fear. Not panic, not hysteria. Fear in the sense of uncertainty. Because if the Invictus Games lose the veterans, what exactly remains? This is where Prince Harry and Meghan Markle reportedly find themselves in an impossible position. Defenders will say they've done nothing wrong. Critics will say they've done too much. But the reality is this. Their presence is now inseparable from the controversy. Every decision is interpreted, every appearance analyzed, every silence questioned. And the cruel irony is that Invictus was created to rise above exactly this kind of distraction. So here we are, months before 2027 planning reaches critical stages, whispers growing louder, withdrawals allegedly stacking quietly in the background. And a question that no one wants to answer publicly. Has Invictus drifted so far from its roots that the people it exists for no longer recognize it? Or is this a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control? Because what comes next doesn't just affect one event. It affects Prince Harry's legacy, Meghan Markle's public role, and most importantly, the veterans who feel caught in the middle of a cultural battle they never asked to fight. And just when organizers thought the situation couldn't get more delicate, something happened behind closed doors that made this no longer a private concern. What if I told you that the Invictus Games started as a quiet, almost personal mission, and not the global spectacle the world sees today? You might think you know the story. Prince Harry, wounded soldiers, triumph over adversity. But the truth, or at least the truth insiders whisper about, is far richer, far more complicated, and far more fragile than most people realize. From the very beginning, Invictus wasn't meant to be glamorous. It wasn't about red carpets, flashing cameras, or media-friendly moments. It was about survival, about recovery, about dignity reclaimed. The very word Invictus means unconquered, and that's exactly what the founders wanted it to represent. Picture this: a group of veterans, some missing limbs, others carrying invisible scars. PTSD, traumatic injuries, the kind of challenges most civilians cannot imagine. And there, in the middle of all of this, was Prince Harry. A royal by birth, yes, but also a soldier who had seen combat, who had trained with them, sweated alongside them, and shared the silent understanding of pain and resilience. The early days of Invictus were raw. No celebrity interviews, no orchestrated photo ops. Just the athletes, their teams, their families, and Harry quietly walking among them, offering respect, attention, and encouragement. Veterans recall, even today, how rare it is to be treated with that kind of focus without feeling like a story or a spectacle. For many, that alone created loyalty. Loyalty not to a monarchy, not to a cause, but to a principle, that their struggles mattered. But it wasn't just about visibility. The games gave structure. They gave purpose. Many veterans described training in ways they never thought possible post-injury, finding new ways to test themselves, to push limits, to prove to themselves, not anyone else, that their bodies and spirits could endure. And let's be honest, before Invictus, Few programs were willing to put athletes with disabilities on a world stage and celebrate them in the same way they celebrated able-bodied athletes. That was revolutionary. For a soldier whose identity had been defined by physical capability, suddenly being told that they were champions in their own right, even with wounds or scars, was transformative. The early competitions were messy. The logistics were brutal. Wheelchair basketball in a gym that wasn't fully wheelchair accessible. Swimming events in unfamiliar pools. Adaptive track events with limited equipment. Yet, veterans describe it as electric. No one cared about the imperfections. They cared about the triumph. And Harry? He was there, not to lead, but to witness, to champion, to validate. It was intimate. It was genuine. And for a while, it was untouchable. But here's the first tension point that most people gloss over: scale. As Invictus grew, media attention grew. Sponsors emerged. Global coverage began to shape the narrative. The games were no longer a private celebration of resilience. They became a stage, a spectacle. That's when small cracks started to appear. Not cracks that everyone could see, but subtle, slow, almost imperceptible shifts in perception. Veterans began noticing how the coverage highlighted the royals, how the interviews focused on them, sometimes more than the athletes, how sound bites about celebrity involvement often overshadowed athletes' achievements. And while the games themselves continued to deliver on purpose and experience, the optics, the way the world viewed it, began to create a tension that would grow in time. Let me give you an example. Imagine a wounded soldier crossing the finish line in a grueling wheelchair race. Pain etched into every line of their body. Victory in every strained breath. Cameras flash. And the headlines? Prince Harry cheers on athletes at Invictus Games. You feel that dissonance? That small, almost imperceptible sidelining of the central figure, the athlete themselves? Veterans felt it. They felt it deeply. And that feeling, repeated year after year, starts to accumulate. Another aspect that often goes unspoken is the sense of ownership. The games were created for veterans, by someone who understood them. But as visibility increased, veterans began to feel a loss of control. Planning committees, sponsorship decisions, media coordination, all these elements started creeping into spaces that veterans once occupied exclusively. And with that, the original sense of intimate purpose began to feel diluted. Now, don't get me wrong. For many veterans, this was still a positive experience. Life-changing, even. But for a growing subset, especially those whose service experiences had taught them to value authenticity and accountability above all else, the creeping sense of intrusion, of optics overtaking essence, was troubling. And it's here we see the seeds of the current crisis. Because veterans who once felt completely aligned with Invictus, who once trusted that Harry, as a fellow soldier, had their back, now started questioning whether the games were still theirs. Whether their sacrifices and their journeys were being honored for what they were, or whether they had become a backdrop, a prop in a story increasingly focused elsewhere. Let's pause and consider how intense that must feel. Soldiers spend years training, fighting, and risking their lives to serve a mission. They know discipline. They understand hierarchy. They know when to speak and when silence is wiser. And then suddenly, they find themselves in a position where they're being seen, not for their resilience, but for someone else's image, someone else's narrative. That's a profound dissonance. It's also deeply human, because we all want to be seen for who we truly are, for what we've accomplished, not as supporting characters in someone else's story. And when that fundamental need goes unmet repeatedly, even quietly, frustration builds. Resentment begins to form. And eventually, even the most loyal will consider walking away. There's another piece that often gets overlooked. Harry didn't just launch the games. He invested himself in them emotionally. He knew the risks, the pressures, the scrutiny. He understood the stakes. For him, the games were more than a charitable endeavor. They were a personal mission. And that mission was built on trust. Trust between him and the veterans. Trust that they shared values. Trust that the games would honor them first, always. And yet, as the games grew, the structure around him began to change. Organizers, sponsors, media, all actors outside the military culture started to wield influence. Decisions that once would have been simple, like prioritizing certain events or focusing on athlete stories, became entangled with branding, optics, and public image. This isn't necessarily malicious. It's just the reality of scale, but it set the stage for the perceived disconnect that has now become a storm. It's important to emphasize something here. No one is accusing anyone of intentional harm, yet. And that's part of why this story is so compelling. The tension isn't about villains or heroes. It's about values in collision, about perception and reality diverging, about an institution expanding faster than the culture around it can absorb. Veterans, meanwhile, continued to train. They continued to compete. They continued to commit. But quietly, in conversations away from the cameras, away from PR teams, questions started surfacing. Is this still ours? Do they really understand what we're sacrificing? Or are we just props now? These questions, initially whispered, gradually became louder. And that's the quiet seed of what would eventually blossom into a full-blown withdrawal crisis. Because soldiers, when pushed past frustration into finality, act decisively. They walk away. They withdraw consent. They reclaim autonomy. And that, my friends, brings us to the precipice of the current scandal. 2,000 veterans allegedly deciding that enough is enough. 2,000 voices, long accustomed to being disciplined, now quietly uniting in one shared decision, to step back. That's why the introduction of external factors, the ones that we'll explore in detail in the following chapters, has been so destabilizing. The veterans weren't angry initially. They weren't demanding headlines. They weren't seeking confrontation, but they were observing. And observation is dangerous when paired with disappointment.